Welcome to Love Your Neighbor 2024. Thank you for coming out. I know some people are trickling in, getting some of our breakfast. Thank you for coming out and spending your Saturday with us. Just to be encouraged and reminded about what God calls us to in regards to loving our neighbor well. This is obviously a difficult year. Everybody knows that. I think everybody can tell. So with the year marked by division and just rising political tension, Christ still calls the church to be a countercultural example of reconciliation, restoration. So I hope that this event is a way to equip you to do that and do that in some practical ways as we will announce through the event. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just wanted to go ahead and thank some sponsors that made this event happen. I'm encouraged that we had so many partners willing to partner with us in this and fund this event. I just wanted to thank Set Free Alliance, North Hills Church, We Welcome, Village Church Anglican, Mitchell Road Presbyterian, and Switch SC. Without their support, this event wouldn't have happened. They helped provide the funds to do this. Also just wanted to thank the World Relief Upstate team for making this happen. You've met a lot of them helping out with different things this morning, so this wouldn't have happened without them. And also I just wanted to thank the National Immigration Forum, the Evangelical Immigration Table, and Holy Post Media for allowing some of their staff and their leaders to come speak this morning. Without further ado, I just wanted to introduce our keynote. Caitlin Chess is an author, speaker, and perpetual theology student. She's the author of The Ballot in the Bible that came out in 2023, and The Liturgy of Politics that came out in 2020. And her writing has appeared in Christianity Today, The New York Times, Christ and Pop Culture, Relevant, and Sojourner. She's the co-host and senior editor of the Holy Post podcast. She has a master in theology and systematic theology from Dallas Theological Seminary and is currently a doctoral student in theology at Duke Divinity. Please join me in welcoming Caitlin Chess.
Thank you, Austin. Good morning. It's wonderful to be with y'all. I don't have enough hands for what I'm doing here. Good morning. As someone who spends a lot of my time thinking and talking about politics, as you might have heard from Austin's introduction, I've learned that when I show up places, people can be a little nervous. I don't understand that because I love talking about faith and politics, but I understand some of y'all are nervous. Some of you are maybe nervous because you have correct political opinions and you're worried I don't share your correct political opinions. Some of you might be nervous because you're friends with the people who have the correct political opinions and you're worried I won't agree with them and we'll fight and it will be bad. So before we get into everything today, I thought we would just take a deep breath together. Can we do that? It's going to be okay. I brought a Bible up here, so it's all going to be fine. We're being very biblical here. I have learned that when we have conversations about faith and politics, we tend to jump to the issues, right? Here's a list of political issues, or here's a list of candidates. Let's find some Bible verses that kind of fit either side. We jump to who we should vote for, who we should support, what policies we should care about, what we should think. We don't often enough ask what kind of people we need to be to do this well, or what broader story we're supposed to be living into. So today, I'm going to share with you two things that might make you a little frustrated. On the one hand, I think Christians are called by God to engage in politics. On the other hand, I think engaging in politics threatens to corrupt our souls. That's rough. So we're going to hopefully feel this tension together, and then some resources that might help us address this tension. So first, before we get into that, we're going to talk about a biblical account of political life and why we need to engage in it, why I think it is a call upon all Christians to engage in politics as an act of love for our neighbor. Then we'll get into the corrupting our souls part, and then hopefully my answer to this tension, which is the gifts that the church gives us for navigating this tension, for engaging in politics as an act of love for our neighbors without losing our souls. But first, before we get into the biblical account, let's first just define some terms here. I think it's important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about politics. So most of the time, when I say the word politics, you all have some images that come to mind. This is the first picture in the slides, if we could move to that one. This is probably what comes to your mind when you think about politics, right? Voting, elected officials, maybe some judges. If we're really thinking broadly, we might even think of some local elected officials, but mostly these kinds of mechanisms of government is what we're thinking of. And that's part of politics, absolutely. But what I want us to think is this next picture, the next slide. When I say politics, I want you to think of these kinds of images, of a city, of a community, of cultivating a garden. Because when I say politics, what I mean is a much fuller thing. Just seeking the flourishing of the community that we are a part of. So for the next few minutes, when I say the word politics, that's what I want you to think. Seeking the flourishing of the community you're a part of. Because the word politics, even just that word that we use, the root word there is the Greek word polis, that just means city or community. So politics involves all of these mechanisms, but it also just involves building a common life together. So when I say politics, that's what I want you to think, building a common life together, cultivating a garden. And I really get this description of politics from Scripture. And before we get into some of these passages, there's a really important reason that I'm saying we want to broaden out our understanding of what politics is. And it's because we've already joked about this morning backstage, but usually when I come to talk about politics, someone at some point will say, okay, so who do I vote for? And what I want us to start off knowing about politics is that our political life is so much bigger and diverse than one vote every 4 years, which you should be voting more often, actually, than every 4 years. There are some other really important votes. But even beyond those important votes, I want you to think of your political life as a diverse group of opportunities to seek the flourishing of your community through voting, through showing up to city council meetings, through writing letters to elected officials, to bringing casseroles to your next door neighbor. All of this is what's involved in building a flourishing common life together. So let's get into Scripture, and we're going to start, you can move to the next slide, with a very good place to start, which is at the very beginning in Genesis. I'm going to read a passage that you all certainly know, but we're going to think about it in a new light. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, we've all heard this creation account before, right? And maybe some of us have even started to see in this creation account a picture of human life, right? This is the commission given to you, to fill and subdue the earth, to be in relationship with one another. What I see, as someone who studies politics, is that there are some political words used here. To rule, to reign, to subdue. At the very beginning of the story, human beings, both Adam and Eve, are given a commission to rule and reign over creation, not to dominate, not to destroy, but to rule and reign, to take the good gifts of God's creation and make a flourishing community out of it. Not just through procreation, but through ruling over all of creation, the creatures that God has made, the creation God has given them. And this commission, they immediately mess up, but the commission is never revoked. God doesn't say, oh, you've done such a bad job of ruling and reigning, I think you're done here. No, this commission continues. And I think it's important to start this way because most of our conversations about politics understandably start with sin, because most of our experience of politics is about sin, right? But it's important to remember, before we get into what makes politics so challenging, so threatening to corrupt our souls, to start with this picture. There are opportunities for us to fulfill this commission, to rule and reign, to seek the flourishing of our communities by taking the good gifts of God's creation and making something beautiful out of it. So political action is not a result of the fall. It begins in creation. This mandate that's given to us is never revoked. Loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So the end of the story, this beautiful description of reconciliation, of the redemption of all creation, we might expect that if we started with a garden, we'd end with a garden. right? A beautiful garden, we messed up our commission, let's start all over again, new garden. There's not a garden here. There's not a church. The picture of human reconciliation with one another and with God that the writer of Revelation chooses is a city. Now you might think, okay, a city, again, me thinking about politics, I think a city is a picture of human community, of humans taking those good gifts of God's creation and fulfilling that commission, now able to do it perfectly without the effects of sin. That mandate given in Genesis that's never revoked is perfectly fulfilled in Revelation, where people have taken the good gifts of God's creation and made a beautiful, flourishing community with it. Redemption doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. Redemption means that this commission is perfected. In fact, it says in Isaiah 60 that the kings will bring the wealth of the nations into the New Jerusalem. A picture of all of the work that we do here on earth, all of our culturally specific work, right? Isaiah is talking about all these kings of all these nations bringing their good gifts into eternity, which to me means that the acts of reconciliation that we do now, the acts of faithful political work that we do now, they're not just wiped away in eternity. They're appropriately perfected and redeemed and brought into the New Jerusalem with us. In fact, a lot of the verses that we tend to go to in the Bible to justify political inaction, you may have heard some of these, like Philippians 3:20, Hebrews 13:14, Ephesians 2:19. These all talk about our citizenship being in heaven, right? And as someone who talks about politics, I'm very used to someone kind of throwing one of these verses at me, like, oh, my citizenship is in heaven, so I don't have to care about the political world around us. Instead, I think these verses remind us that there is something central about our identity as Christians that is political. The best language that the writers of the New Testament have for describing our identity and community is citizenship. There is a political dimension to what it means to be a part of the people of God. In fact, this is the beginning of the people of God. The first conversation that God has with Abraham is not just, I will bless you, I will make you a nation, but it is, you will be a blessing to the nations. The people of God oriented outwards towards the larger creation from the very beginning, constantly failing to fulfill that, but oriented that way. So, from Genesis to Revelation, we have this picture of the people of God oriented towards the world, seeking the flourishing of creation. And you're probably thinking, yeah, that doesn't describe my experience of political life at all. I have no real experience of just like, in all good intention, seeking the flourishing of my community and it being totally successful and God-glorifying and wonderful, right? Well, we have a whole bunch of verses in the middle here that describe that very well. So we're going to go to Isaiah 1. Because we see in this continuing story of the people of God, especially in the life and work of the prophets, this constant refrain that the life of worship and our political life are deeply intertwined, but it is messy. So this is what Isaiah says in chapter 1, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now, it's important because we're coming in the middle of the chapter here. You might think Isaiah is talking to Sodom and Gomorrah. He's not. He's just being very rude to Israel. He's like, you are like the worst people you can imagine, Sodom and Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you? This trampling of my courts. I love that he's saying, who asked you to bring sacrifices to me? Because if I was the people listening, I would be like, you did. You explicitly asked for this. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. And then this verse 15, incredibly sobering verse in the Bible. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the cause of the widow. So here we not only see a description of what I already said, right? Engagement in the life of the world does threaten to corrupt our souls. Here we see that the people of God are exhibiting one of our perennial temptations, which is to believe that our worship of God and the practices that he has given us justify our injustice, justify our mistreatment of people made in God's image. In fact, in Isaiah, what I see, and we'll get to this more in a minute, is that when our spiritual formation practices, the festivals, the sacrifices for Israel, but we might say the church services, the spiritual disciplines for us, when our spiritual formation practices go unexamined, when we're not paying attention to what they are oriented to, they end up causing us to participate in rituals that are detestable to God. We are seeking to be obedient, and we end up being detestable to God. Good practices, and I hope we'll give some example of those in a minute, can lead us in the direction of seeking justice, defending the oppressed, goals that have unavoidably political dimensions. Again, remember, political the way that I just described it, seeking a flourishing community. This is the word of God to the people of God saying, you're doing all of the right things, but you're not fulfilling the goal I have actually given you, which is to create a community that is just and good. This might be the most common perversion for God's people, to expect our religious devotion to excuse our injustice. And Isaiah over and over again rebukes God's people for fasting and thinking God will notice while they mistreat their workers, while they fight with one another, while they hit each other. It's important, though, that Isaiah is not substituting justice for spiritual formation. He's not saying, okay, just do the justice work and don't care about the practices, the sacrifices, the rituals. No, he's tying them intimately together. Later in chapter 58, he says, is this not the fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. The language of spiritual formation and seeking justice are intimately tied together. We'll come back to this later when it comes to our corporate practices, our spiritual disciplines, but we shouldn't miss this. The work of losing the chains of injustice is still described in terms of spiritual formation. You can't separate these. You can't say I have my spiritual formation practices over here where I get right with God and feel really good internally, and then I have my justice work over here. Or I pick one or the two of them. No, they're intimately tied together. It's also crucial to notice here in Isaiah something that the prophets do over and over and over again. Tie idolatry and injustice together. This is another way that spiritual formation and our political lives are tied deeply together. Isaiah says, if you are worshiping an idol, you will inevitably end up mistreating people made in God's image. Because that idol will ask more and more and more of you until the only way you can give it what it wants is to harm people made in God's image. If you're worshiping money, eventually it will ask more and more and more of you until you have to steal or exploit other people to get it. That idol, if it's popularity or success, eventually it will ask more and more and more of you until you have to trample over other people to serve it. These two are always tied together. So this is a biblical theology of politics. I could show you a biblical theology of politics in every verse of the Bible because I truly believe every verse is about politics in some way, shape, or form. But this is just the beginning, a little picture of our political life. A commission given to humans in the beginning, never revoked, a commission to take the good gifts of God's creation and make something beautiful with it. A commission fulfilled in the end of the story, where we spend eternity creating these flourishing communities, continuing the work we do now. The work we do now deeply matters, but it will be appropriately perfected and redeemed in eternity. And as we respond to this commission here and now, we face temptations the people of God have always faced, towards spiritual formation practices that malform us, towards mistreating each other and the vulnerable, towards viewing ourselves as the good guys who will do everything right when actually we face many of these temptations ourselves. So this defines our political life. We must be involved. We are required to be oriented toward the flourishing of our communities, which means we get caught up in politics. And yet, engagement in politics threatens to corrupt our souls. So what do we do with this tension? Hopefully you feel it. The first thing I think we have to do is see rightly what we're dealing with here. Too many of us, truly, especially as Christians, think we can just march out into politics armed with our good theology and our good intentions, and we will change the world. And our history colorfully shows us that very often we go in with good intentions, and somewhere along the way they get corrupted. And we find out we're not even trying anymore to do the things that we thought we were trying to do. How does that happen? We think the problem with our politics is a problem of information. You believe differently than I do. You see the facts differently than I do. You weighed out your pro-con list between the two candidates in a different way than I did. But most of us are starting to realize our politics doesn't run on cognitive information. You can move to the next slide. This is what most of our politics looks like. There's not a lot of cognitive information in any of these ads. There's emotions and stories. Psychologists have even shown that when you see a scary campaign ad, even if it's for someone that you're not a fan of, even if you cognitively don't believe the threat they are describing for you, your body responds as if you do. The same chemicals go through your brain as if you are facing a literal threat in front of you. This is how our politics runs, off of fear, off of storytelling, off of emotion. When my first book came out in 2020, pastors would ask me a lot to come to their churches, well, to Zoom into their churches, because it was 2020. And they would say, I should put up on a slide some of the emails I got, because most of the emails basically went like this: could you come and just fix everything? Things are really bad. I don't actually have a specific request. Just if you could come and give a really good talk, or just give a great sermon on a Sunday. I think that would just straighten it out, right? Everyone would get it out. We'd be good. That was only a few years ago, and I think more than even then, we now know that's not gonna happen, right? No great sermon is fixing all of our problems, because these are our problems. Our problems are problems of emotion and storytelling and what happens chemically in our bodies. Here's what I think we miss most in our political theology. We are not usually engaging in politics from our theology, from our ideas, from our best intentions. We're engaging from a deeper place than we're often conscious of, the place of stories, emotions, and identities. Even us. Sometimes when I start talking about this, I can see people going, I know someone like that. I know someone whose politics is so shaped by emotions and storytelling and identity. It's us too. One of the things I think we've all learned over the past few years is that people cannot be fed a steady diet of cable news and social media and political advertisements and not have it affect their spiritual lives. It does. It affects us spiritually, it affects us theologically. In part because there are some things about humans, how we best function, that we are emotional, that we are storytelling creatures, that we walk through the world pulled by desires and fears, that politics has actually understood better than many of our modern churches. People come in and we're like, we have great ideas for you. And that's not how we're running in the world. So I like to use the language of political gospels. And I like using the language of gospels in part because most of the stories we encounter in our political life are just kind of drawing on or corrupting a little bit the best, truest story there is, the real gospel. Most of them get their power from being a kind of corrupted version of that story. So this is how they work. They say, this is what a good life looks like. This is what's ultimately wrong with the world. This is what will ultimately fix it. And this is the exciting part you get to play in it. This is most of the stories that our politics run off of. They run off of a sense of our loves and our loyalties, what we love and who we are loyal to. And they operate off of these various forms. Emotion, which is not bad. Emotion is not a bad thing. It gives us information, but it can also be easily manipulated. So those last pictures you just saw, right? They're intended to evoke in you an emotion that will cause you to engage in politics in a certain way. And the scariest thing about all of this for me is not just that it will affect how those people vote, but that it will affect how they see their neighbors, what they believe theologically, how they live in the world, even outside of the ballot box. So they run on emotion, they run on storytelling. We are storytelling creatures. We can't help it. We tell stories about ourselves, about our communities, about our country, our state, even every church you've ever been a part of, right? Tells a story about where we came from and who we are and what makes sense of why we do the things that we do. And politics tells fantastic stories, captivating stories. And they run off identity and community, which is how they create loyalty, right? Loyalty is a sense of identity and community, who I am and who I belong to. And we all have markers of identity and community, the clothes you wear, the language you use, the community that you live in, the church you go to, the people you associate with, but we're not always very critical or thoughtful about what is defining my sense of identity and my sense of community. And politics loves that. Let me provide for you a sense of who you are and who you belong to. So these are the tools they use: fear, desire, love, hate. These stories, these loyalties are communicated to us primarily through this emotion that we receive, that we learn from. We see scary images in these videos, and we learn who the bad guys are and who the good guys are and how to engage in our communities. So the first thing we have to be able to do to engage in politics without losing our souls is recognize these gospels for what they are. I used to give a bunch of examples of these gospels, but now I get worried that people just hear all of my examples and go, okay, so those are the 4, and I will now look for them out in the world. There are so many. There are so many stories that politics uses. I'll give one example very quick, because I do think it's one of the most common examples in our political life in America. The prosperity gospel. Now, most of us in a church like this probably are going, oh, I know the prosperity gospel, and that's 100% not me. I know those people. There's a guy in a shiny suit, and he has a jet, and if you give him your seed money, you'll have health, wealth, and prosperity forever. That's not what I mean. That's a version of it. What I mean by the prosperity gospel is this pervasive American belief that if you are a good person and you work hard, you deserve a good life. Whether God provides it, or the free market provides it, or the universe provides it, but if you're a good person and you work hard, you deserve health, wealth, and happiness. This is a powerful story, and it's a story that doesn't hold up to how the gospel describes wealth and poverty, how the gospel describes what makes a good human life, how the gospel describes how we are supposed to respond to people in our communities, but it's a powerful story that can shape our lives if we're not cautious of it. So how do we think well about these gospels? Well, when I was a kid, every year before Christmas, my mom would tell me and my sister to play a little game with the TV commercials that we would see. Because, right before Christmas, all the commercials start being toys for kids to put on their Christmas lists. And my mom didn't know she was teaching us such good media literacy, but she was. She said, okay, when all the ads come on, I want you to find the lie. Find the lie in the ad. It's good, right? So what I most clearly remember about this is that there was a year when I was probably like 8 or 9, where maybe I was younger than that, where I really wanted a Barbie that made cookies. And it literally came with like a little easy bake oven, and you would make the cookies in it. And one day I'm watching the ad, and I'm remembering what my mom said and thinking, okay, find the lie. And suddenly it hits me, the Barbie doesn't make the cookies. I have to make the cookies. Like, I have to stir the little bowl and put it in the tiny easy bake oven, and she just stands there in an apron and looks really cute. This was a really helpful way for us to think about the media we are consuming, right? Because here's the thing, I did get the Barbie for Christmas. It was very fun. But I actually had better expectations for that Barbie that I opened under the tree once I had found the lie. I wasn't expecting the Barbie to be something that it couldn't be. I think this is true for our political lives too. We find the lie. We find the false gospel that's lurking underneath the policy or the politician, because it won't be obvious. It won't be explicit. And sometimes the false gospel underneath it, you might still vote for the person. You might still support the policy. But if we can identify that false story that's humming underneath it, we can learn what's true and what's false in it. Because there's always a little bit of truth. There's always a little bit of the true gospel that they've snuck in there. But we have to learn to find the lie. So what do we do besides finding the lie? Because I've just said that we're not just brains on a stick. We're not just bringing in information. It can't all just be about ideas. We need help with emotions and stories and the world as we experience it with our bodies. So what else do we have to be able to both engage in politics but not lose our souls? What do we have? Well, the best news I have to offer you is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I started working on this stuff when I was quite young. I think I was like 23, which is dumb. But the reason I got into it was because I realized I don't have some new curriculum. I don't have some new brilliant idea that will fix it all. I'm just a seminary student who's read a ton of books about how Christians throughout history have done this. And I think I've found some good things to learn from them. So many of us facing a challenging election year think, especially in our churches, we've got to have some new plan. We have to have some new curriculum. We've got to have some amazing idea that will fix everything. We don't. We have resources from Christian history for responding to these perennial temptations. And you might think I'm silly, but they're kind of the boring, normal things we do in the church. But I think we have to think about them just a little bit differently. So first, we have the gift of corporate worship. I know what you're thinking. You think that the local church is going to help us with our political lives? That seems crazy. Yes, I do. I really do think it will. Because one of the gifts that our corporate worship together offers us is a chance to learn deeply with our bodies in community what our true identity and community are in the midst of a world that wants to sell us a different idea of community and identity. So how do we live together in our churches and act as if it's true we are a family? That our primary identity is in Christ, not merely as individuals, but collectively? We have resources for this. We don't have to make up something new, but we need to emphasize this element of our practices that we might have forgotten. First, one of the examples that I think really forms this in us is baptism. Now, it's always scary talking to Christians about something that has divided Christians for all of history. I used to have a whole section about communion, and we cut that because that one's just like really complicated. Baptism, we have fights about, but of course we have fights about it because it's so important that of course that's been the thing we have focused on. But here's what I think is so important to think about baptism when it comes to our political lives. I love standing up and making promises to people. In my church, when someone gets baptized, I'm like the first person to stand up because I want to be obligated to them and them to be obligated to me. I love every time in my church when we stand up and with our bodies remind each other that our primary sense of community is not biological or racial or socioeconomic or national. By the grace of God, we belong to one another through bonds that transcend all of those things. And we get to use our bodies in our communities to remind ourselves of that. So whether you're baptizing little babies, like my church does, or adults, this is still true, right? We get to believe this incredible truth that our political world doesn't understand, that we actually belong to one another besides all of the things that divide us. Secondly, this is a story that I love to tell about my church. I've told the elders of my church that I am publicly criticizing them when I do this because I love this practice that we have, but I kind of hated the way we did it. So a few years ago, my church decided instead of having volunteers in the nursery opt in to volunteering in the nursery, you would have to opt out. I love how people respond to that every time. So if you're a member of the church, you're going to serve in the nursery unless you opt out, which you can, but most people don't. What I love about this is that it's another way that we are reminded our fundamental ties to one another are not biological, they're not socioeconomic, they're not racial. We belong to one another such that we have to take care of one another's, not that we have to, that we get to take care of one another's children. And this was my criticism of my church. For many weeks before we implemented this new policy, because any of you who work in churches know, before you make a change like this, you have to talk about it for a long time. And so our elders would get up in front of the church and they would do the same thing every time. They would go, y'all, we've got to bear this burden together. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. And I was sitting in the pew going, let me up there, please. Because I want to get up and say, y'all, we belong to one another as a family. We get to belong to one another and serve one another. And in this church, there's no such thing as other people's children. I pick up a baby at a potluck because I'm like, it's going to fall down those stairs. That's beautiful. This is the family of God. And it's teaching us something in our bodies that the world outside wants to tell us is a lie. So these are two of the ways that we learn a different sense of community and identity. Next, other than corporate worship, we need to also think about our personal spiritual lives. The church has incredible resources to address these constant temptations that we have described, these false gospels, these lies we're being sold. But we've often stuck them in the category of spiritual life, right? Spiritual discipline, spiritual practices, that's for you and God, not for you and the world. And that's not true. So I want us to think together a little bit about how some spiritual disciplines could help us combat the temptation toward political idolatry in our lives, could help us be the kind of people that can engage in politics, that don't have to be afraid that engaging in it will harm our souls. We don't need a new curriculum, we don't need a novel idea, but we can return to the spiritual disciplines of the church. There are spiritual disciplines described in Scripture. There are spiritual disciplines that different traditions of Christianity have practiced and passed on. I'm not going to tell you what spiritual disciplines to practice, because again, if I say here are the 5 great examples I have, you'll go, okay, those are the 5 that I need to do for an election year. That's not true. I'm going to just give you some examples that I hope will stimulate some thinking for you, because it'll be specific to us and our communities, to the temptations that we uniquely face, to the resources our community has, to who lives in your household with It's rhythm. You need rhythm. So there needs to be like, I do this every day. I do this every week. I do this 3 times a day. Some kind of regular rhythm. Because again, as much as we like to think we are thinking creatures, we're more than that. We need rhythms to fall into. We can't always rely on just our will to do it. Like, I'm going to be really good this. No, we need it to be regular rhythm. So anything you take on, think about, does it have rhythm? Does it use important language? We're shaped. How we think about the world and how we engage in it by the language that we have learned to use. This is why the church has passed down creeds and hymns, because we need words to help us remember who we are and how we engage in the world. And lastly, it should involve our bodies, right? If we're combating this idea that the only thing that's wrong with our politics is the ideas that we have, the practices that we do need to involve our bodies. Whether it's, I do this practice on a walk, I kneel when I do this practice, I hold hands with someone else, there needs to be our bodies involved in it. So they need to involve these 3 things: rhythm, language, and bodies. And I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples. Again, these are not prescriptive, don't think these are the ones I have to do, but just to stimulate your thinking. One example is one that I did during the 2016 election when I was a seminary student. I got extra credit for doing spiritual disciplines, which I don't think is good, but I did. So I thought, okay, fall 2016, what practice am I gonna do? I decided to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. Now, I use this example partially because you might be thinking, okay, that's an example of those spiritual disciplines that are just you and God. They're not you and the world. Here's how it shaped me that semester. My phone would go off 3 times a day, morning, middle of the day, and evening, and I would pray the Lord's Prayer. And sometimes I would just pray it, probably 50% of the time. I would just pray the words, check the box, I'm done. Sometimes I would have been in the midst of a really challenging conversation at my church about the political division that was eating us up. And I would pray, your kingdom come. And I would think, I have never wanted that so badly. Or I would be walking down a street in Dallas, and I would pray, give us this day our daily bread, and I would have just passed somebody who was in desperate need of their daily bread. And I would think, can I pray prayers I'm not willing to be the answer to? Or sometimes I would get on social media and see Christians fighting about politics and just think, I cannot stand these people. And then my phone would go off and I would pray, our Father, and think, these people who I don't understand at all, who I disagree with so deeply, we share a Father. So that practice deeply shaped my election year that year. My second example, fasting and feasting. Many of us have grown up in traditions where we think of fasting as something that you do just, again, you and God, right? I deprive myself of something, usually food, to kind of focus my attention and dependence on God. When I was doing research for my first book before 2020, I was doing all this reading in the early church and the practices that they did, and I learned that fasting sometimes meant that for them. It also very often meant something very different. When someone in the community didn't have enough to eat, and no one else had excess to give them, a few of them would get together and say, we'll fast for a few days so that we come up with more excess food to feed this person who's hungry. So this practice that we think of as totally individual, me and God, was actually oriented towards the flourishing of the community. So how can we practice depriving ourselves of some good gift of God for a period of time in order to give more generously, in order to provide for others what we weren't originally able to provide? In the Christian tradition, fasting has always been connected with feasting. So you don't get fasting without feasting, right? If you're in a tradition that celebrates Lent, right, you have 40 days of fasting, but then 50 days of Easter. The biblical scholar N.T. Wright says that if we fast for 40 days of Lent, we should drink champagne for breakfast for 50 days of Easter, which I don't think you should necessarily do, but something like that, right? Every day of Easter, have tried to think of like, what's a feasting thing I can do? What's a celebratory thing I can do? So if we fast from things, we can feast either in taking those things we've deprived ourselves of and feasting with other people, not just people like us, not just people who can reciprocate, but with people who maybe can't. There was a Lent that my small group decided we were going to give up any excess spending for Lent, but then every Sunday, because every Sunday is a little Resurrection Sunday, you get off of your fast, we would take whatever we hadn't spent that week and use it kind of extravagantly on someone who needed it. Sometimes it was anonymous, sometimes it was, here's a charity that we could give to. Sometimes it was, someone in this church is having a really rough time and can't pay their tuition, and I'm just gonna send some off, So how could we practice regular rhythms of fasting and feasting? We might consider practicing some fasting and feasting in our political lives more specifically. Sometimes when I go to talk to people, they're like, please let me fast from all political media because I'm so sick of it, which might not be a bad idea. But if we do this, if we do fasting and feasting together, maybe some of us during an election year do need to fast a little bit from some of the worst kinds of political media. The big national stuff that might not always have anything we can affect, the commentary that's just angry, that doesn't actually give us information, but just makes us feel what the person is feeling. Maybe we isolate some forms of political media that are really destructive to us, and we fast from them for a season. But then what's the feast? The feast could be, I actually engage in politics. Not just consuming media, which is not engaging in politics. People tell me all the time, I'm so sick of politics. I've been scrolling Twitter for hours. It's not politics. I'm so sorry. You've been consuming political media. You haven't been doing politics. So maybe we fast from some consumption of political media, and we feast by showing up to a city council meeting, by writing a letter to an elected official, by bringing a casserole to a next door neighbor, to actually engaging in politics with the resources we have in the way God has called us. And why is that feasting? Well, because actually sometimes we discover there's moments of that are really beautiful, that are real gifts of God, that look a little bit like that picture in the garden or that picture in Revelation. But they're harder and harder to experience the more we're just consuming really nasty political media. So fasting and feasting, some examples. There are so many other things you might want to adopt this year, practices that can help you engage well without losing your soul. I told you I wasn't going to be prescriptive, but I am going to be prescriptive about one thing. This is my one recommendation that I think absolutely everyone should do. And it's to do a little media audit. I was just talking about this. All of this political media that we're consuming has this ability to really corrupt our souls. So let's do a checkup. Let's evaluate for ourselves and in our communities, how is the media I'm consuming affecting me? Because we do it pretty mindlessly. So here's how I would recommend it. Start with prayer. Always a good way. Create an outline of your regular day. Just from the moment you get up till the moment you go to sleep, write down everything you consume. Not just explicitly political stuff, everything. Podcasts, books, TV, radio, I don't know what other people listen to, but anything you listen to or consume, write it down, and then evaluate it. Paying specific attention to the medium, because the medium really does matter. Anything that includes both audio and video will be more captivating to you than just one or the other. Pay attention to the medium. Pay attention to the sources. Where are you getting different forms of media? Pay attention to what they emphasize. So much of our political life right now is a struggle, in part because we're in different worlds media-wise, right? Some people are consuming these things, and so they believe these things are really important and really pressing. These people are listening to totally different people who say, this is the real issue, this is what you should think about. So pay attention. What is this emphasizing? And then pay attention to what your feelings are. What feeling did I have that led me to consume this media? Was it fear I was looking to stoke? Was it anger I was looking to justify? Was it loneliness I was looking to heal? And then ask, did it do that? How did I feel afterwards? How did it affect me? And lastly, invite your community into your discernment. This is pretty scary. But show your audit to someone close to you and say, am I missing anything? Are there things I'm consuming that you think are malforming me that I'm not paying attention to? I need help. And then ask these kinds of questions. These are good general questions to ask of all of our media consumption. What does this make me love? And what does this tempt me to hate? Who or what does this want me to fear and why? What story are they telling about why I should be afraid? Who does this media want me to see as my neighbor? Who does it want me to view with fear or condescension? What problem does this media present? And what solution does it give? These are questions that can help us discern, how is this media shaping me? Not just to the end of how I vote, which I do think matters, but also to the end of how I view my neighbor, how I engage in my community. what I believe is most ultimately true, most of us don't go into politics thinking, I'm going to become someone who thinks that if I'm a good person and live a good life, I deserve health, wealth, and prosperity. But somewhere along the way, we pick up the prosperity gospel without meaning to. Most of us don't go into politics thinking, I would really love to hate my neighbor. But somewhere along the line, we discover that we've been shaped and formed in such a way that we do. So we have to be attentive. We have to ask these kinds of questions. Ultimately, all of the stories that we consume, in the media that we listen to, in the political participation that we do, all of these stories need to be weighed against the most true, most perfect story there is, against the actual real gospel. And that story, that true gospel, doesn't end with violence or dysfunction or pain, but it ends with these words that we already read in Revelation. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you. Thank you for revealing yourself to us in so many ways, including in the words of this text. Thank you for not leaving us in our dysfunction. Thank you for providing for us through the years of the church resources that can help us love our neighbors well, engage in politics without losing our souls. God, I pray that you would bring to mind for us specific things. I pray that as we've been here the last few minutes, we would have come to our mind ways we can engage in our neighborhoods, people we can love well, that maybe we weren't thinking of before. And as we face this election, God, we just ask for your grace for the moments that we mess it up. We ask for your guidance as we make hard decisions. We ask for you to give us love we can't muster on our own for people we don't understand or like. God, we thank you that you have loved us when we were unlovable. We pray that you will give us the ability to do the same for others. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Caitlin. I was really intrigued by just the tension that we have between the call to seek the flourishing of our neighbors, but also the tendency we can have to be corrupted by that engagement as well. So now as we look forward from Caitlin's call, we're going to dive into some specific applications today on how to do this well, some locally, some internationally. And I'm going to introduce those speakers helping us think through this practically. First, I want to introduce Lanre Williams Ayedun. Lanre is our Senior Vice President of International Programs at World Relief. She leads a team of over 1,000 employees serving in 11 countries. With over 20 years of experience in developing community-based programs, Lanre's career spans experience in public health, microfinance, agriculture, and disaster response. And public health, and a certification in human-centered design from Johns Hopkins University. She speaks 4 languages and currently lives in Sterling, Virginia with her husband, Yomi. Lanre will be specifically helping us think through how to love our neighbors across the globe. Next up will be Christy Statz. She's a regional mobilizer for the National Immigration Forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table. She's from Ohio and went to Miami University of Ohio. She worked as a missionary with Crew for 15 years, 11 of which were in the UK, but also spent time serving amidst unreached peoples. She helped create Crossings, a refugee ministry initiative, in 2015, and Crew's International Immigrant and Refugee Initiative simultaneously. In her first years back to the U.S., God developed a heart in her for fixing our broken immigration system. She now does advocacy work that includes mobilizing churches on behalf of the Evangelical Immigration Table, a broad coalition of Christian denominations and organizations focused on encouraging distinctly biblical responses to the challenges and opportunities of immigration in the U.S. She's also a consultant for the National Immigration Forum and works with the faith, law enforcement, and business leaders working for immigration reform. She's finishing her master's in theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School this spring. And she'll be helping us think through how to love our immigrant neighbors well. And after Christy, we'll have Chelsea Sobolik, Director of Government Relations for World Relief, talking about how to love well across the political divide. So Chelsea serves as Director of Government Relations for World Relief. Previously, she worked for the leading evangelical child welfare organization in the country, Lifeline Children's Services. She also worked for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention and on Capitol Hill. Chelsea has been published at the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and other outlets. She's also the author of Longing for Motherhood, Holding On to Hope in the Midst of Childlessness and Called to Cultivate, a Gospel Vision for Women in Work. She has a BA in International Relations from Liberty University and lives in Washington, D.C. area with her husband, Michael, and their son, Dev. So we're going to go ahead and introduce Landre to the stage. Join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. This is only my second time in South Carolina, and I'm so excited to be here with you all. Thanks for having me. So we're going to be talking about how to love your global neighbor, your brothers and sisters that are living outside of where we are right now. And I feel somewhat qualified to be the one having this conversation with you because I was one of your global neighbors. I am originally Nigerian, and I grew up in West and East Africa until I came to the US as a teenager. So I was your global neighbor, and I'm going to start off by helping you maybe understand your global neighbor a little bit more. So first, how many extroverts do I have in the room? Raise your hands. Okay, so for the extroverts in the room, good news for you, you have a lot of global neighbors. Over 80% of the world's population lives outside of the US or Europe. So there are a lot of people that you could potentially get to know as your global neighbor. That's why you sometimes can hear them referred to as the majority world. They really are the majority of all of the people that live on this planet. Looking around the room, I think I can say this. Your global neighbor is more than likely younger than you. In fact, if your global neighbor is from Africa, every other person that you would meet would be a young person under the age of 15. While the rate of extreme poverty has been declining in the world, really up until COVID hit, still more than half of your global neighbors live under less than $5 a day. So pause and think about that for a minute. We've all probably spent already more than $5, and it's only 10 a.m. Between the gas that we put in our car, the shoes that we walked into this building with, maybe the beverage that we had this morning. So if $5 is all you had for the rest of the day, you would have a very long, hard, and probably hungry day ahead of you. Your global neighbor is likely Christian, or they've heard the gospel before. The rate of Christianity and the growth of Christianity is not in America or in Europe. It's growing fastest in Africa and in Asia. Your global neighbor is likely a farmer, a herder, or they run some sort of small business, probably trading, selling of some sort. You don't have to worry about if this neighbor is going to be reading your mail or poking through your mail. If your global neighbor is from Chad or South Sudan, for example, only a quarter of them would be able to read and understand a simple sentence. If your neighbor, over 100 million of them have been displaced from their homes. This neighbor that I've been describing to you has more than likely lost or been driven from their home due to conflict or natural disaster. If your neighbor has successfully crossed the border from their country into another country and they've received status, then they might be a refugee. Only a quarter of those refugees actually ever make it to an American or European border. 75% of refugees are hosted in the countries right next to where they have been displaced from. But for every refugee that has crossed a border and is seeking refuge, there are 2 internally displaced people. So these are people that are displaced. They've been moved from their homes, usually due to conflict or a natural disaster, but they're still within the borders of their own country. Most of them are living in a makeshift kind of situation, camps for internally displaced people. It's not, therefore, an exaggeration for me to say that your global neighbor, if they are not currently an internally displaced person, probably at some point in their lives they were or will be. Remember when I said that your global neighbor is probably pretty young? Unfortunately, about 40% of internally displaced people are children. So think about this. Your global neighbor is facing these intertwined challenges and vulnerabilities. A lot of times they're living in these precarious or fragile situations. And yet, they're not all that different from you in their motivations. They're still trying to figure out how to live, how to love, how to raise their families, and how to build a life for themselves. So that's a small picture of who your global neighbor might be. But now you know a little bit more about them. So what are you going to do with this information? In the Bible, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20, Scripture says, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' but he hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he can see cannot love God whom he has not seen." So love your neighbor. We've talked a little bit about who your neighbor is. Now, how do you love them? I actually really love that we're talking about love here. I don't really get to talk about love very much in the course of my work. But I think that love it's a powerful and appropriate word to use in this context. It's really interesting to think, what does love compel us to do for our global neighbor? And I'm going to propose to you that there are three things that love compels us to do. First, love compels us not to turn away from the suffering of our brothers and sisters. I believe that love compels us to embrace humility and a posture of learning about our global neighbors. And I think that love compels us to desire and act for the flourishing of our global brothers and sisters. So I'm going to start by talking about how we at World Relief have chosen to live this out in the global context. And then I'll talk about some practical ways that you can consider doing this as well. Okay, so love compels us not to turn a blind eye to the suffering around us. I don't know if you all know, but World Relief has been a movement by the church, from the church. The work that we do is because of the church. And most of the time, actually, when we work in international spaces, it's not World Relief that people see and know. It is the local church. And the work that we've done has been because the church in the U.S. and the local church have chosen to look suffering square in its face. We were founded out of the Second World War. You know, there was a church in Boston that was looking at the devastation that came after the Second World War in Europe, and their hearts were moved. They decided to fast over Lent, and they collected offerings. And those offerings became the War Relief Fund that eventually became World Relief. And that is our history. In over 80 years of this history, we have worked in over 100 countries, boldly engaging the greatest crises in partnership with the church. Our vision is to see thriving and welcoming communities where families can flourish and people can experience restorative relationships with God, each other, and with all of creation. So as an organization and with partners like many of you in this room, we've actively been turning our eyes to the hardest things that are happening across the globe. We were among the first organizations that came into Rwanda just as the end of the genocide was happening. You know, in that genocide, over 800,000 people lost their lives over the course of 3 months. And World Relief was one of the first organizations that came into the country to help and support. We were there in Haiti in the aftermath of an earthquake, and we remain in Haiti even in the midst of the current crisis. We've responded to cyclones and floods and drought. We've sat alongside families as they have buried loved ones due to AIDS, Ebola, malaria, and other diseases. Often when we come into a community, it is because a church has called and invited us to come and support them. And I love what World Relief does when we actually enter a community. I was recently in Burundi, and I had an opportunity to meet with some churches. We had been doing our signature approach there of bringing churches together across denominations, and we were training them to think about how do we look beyond the walls of our churches and look and see the suffering that's happening in the communities around. And so this committee of churches had gotten together and they wanted to show me some of the work that they'd been doing and the result of this new way of seeing and being the church in their community. So they took me to meet this woman. She was in her 80s, an elderly woman, and she told me about how she had been a member of this particular church her entire life. She'd come to faith in that church. She'd been married in that church. Her children had been dedicated in that church. And she had been in that church when her husband had passed away. She'd been in that church as her health began to fail and her eyesight got worse. She'd been in that church as her children moved away because the farmland that they had been ravaged by cycles of drought and flooding, and her children had moved to try to find a better life. Us to see people that are on the margins. And based on this training, and as they started to search the Bible and understand God's heart for the vulnerable, World Relief invited them to map for themselves who are the people that are experiencing the greatest vulnerability in your community. And it wasn't actually her church. It was a different church in that community that said, this woman is someone that is vulnerable, and we should support her. And so they did. The church came together and they pooled their resources and they got her a health insurance card. In that country, if you have one of those cards, it gives you access to health care. They had come together and they pooled their own seeds, and it was beans, it was green beans that they had come and they had planted her field for her so that she would have beans to eat and to sell. The beans were just starting to ripen when I visited, and she told me, the church promises that they're coming back, and they're going to harvest these beans for me. See, this, friends, is what it means to not turn away from the suffering of other people. This is what it means to truly be the hands and feet of Jesus. This is what it means to love your neighbor well. So why is it that I believe that you and me, the Church of Jesus, why are we the ones that are called to see the suffering of God's people? I think it's because we have the best example. We have a Savior who walked among the poor and the sick and the hurting. And ultimately, we have the best news of hope for people that are suffering. We can boldly follow Jesus into the hurt and into the harm that people have faced without feeling like we might be overcome by it. I have to tell you, some of the days and the things that we work with are hard, right? But we know that Jesus is walking right alongside with us. And we know that we are doing the very thing that he called us to do. And so I believe that it is right, it is our work to be able to look boldly at the suffering and the hurt and the ways that people are not having fullness of life, and to see that and to understand that our hearts can be stirred and that we can invite Jesus to come alongside with us in meeting those needs. So 2, love compels us to embrace humility and a posture of learning. Often when people's eyes are open, when our eyes are open to the great needs that are in the world, there are one of 2 responses that we have. One is to run away as far from it as possible. The other is to run straight into it and want to fix all of it. But have you ever been in those conversations where you're trying to tell someone about a problem that you have and they're giving you a solution before you've even finished describing what the problem is? Any one of you married? My husband knew I was going to say that. We all know that frustration, right? Of someone having a response before they've really understood what it is that we're talking about. And that is why at World Relief, we really try to model this and take this posture of humility. And I propose to you that that is the heart posture that we should all take. That though you may have had an experience with homelessness or poverty in the U.S., your global neighbors and their experiences of those same things could be very different. There are many intertwined and complicated reasons why you are seeing the needs that you are seeing in the global space. And it takes discernment, it takes wisdom to be able to know the best ways to intervene. At World Relief, this looks like sitting with churches and community leaders, sitting with women and children and elders and hearing their stories, understanding their lives before we start trying to work to craft a solution for them. A humbling story I'll tell you. I was recently in a refugee camp in Chad. Chad is in West Africa, and it is always kind of on the bottom 2 of the poorest countries in the world. But it is one of the most hospitable countries to refugees. And so when war had broken out in neighboring Sudan last year, Chad opened up its borders and welcomed millions of people that poured across the border. This very poor country opened up space and tried to be as welcoming as possible. And so I was in this camp in September of last year, and this camp had been set up for about 15,000 people, and there were currently double or more people that were living in this camp. And we had been invited to come in and provide 2 things: soap and high-energy biscuits for children. Basically, the sanitation and hygiene was really problematic, and people didn't have access to soap. And then the kids weren't meeting their nutritional needs. And so we were bringing these high-energy biscuits. And we had done some consultations, and we believed that the most vulnerable people would be the refugees that had newly arrived from Sudan. And so we had enough supplies for those folks. Well, we got to the camp and quickly realized that the camp had a leader. They had organized themselves and elected this very fiery young woman as their leader. And so we entered the camp, and we were sitting in a small room on mats, and she started to talk to us about life in the camp. And she described to us how there were all these people that had been living in this camp, and that they had welcomed the newcomers because it meant that now these people were safe. But it also meant that the resources they had now had to be shared among more people. She talked about how there weren't enough tents there wasn't enough water. They now had to share firewood that they were using to clean the water and to cook. She recounted lots of things that were happening in that camp, and she said to us, so we've met as a camp, we've taken a vote, and we've decided. We know what you all came to do, but we've all decided that we will take a little bit less so that everybody can have some. And that story haunts me, and it encourages me. It haunts me because I thought to myself, here are parents that are choosing to have their children have less so that they don't have to watch other children not have. The depth of the need haunts me. But I was also encouraged that, yes, I have some degrees, I have years of work here, but I don't know everything. And I don't know how this all should go, but the community does. These people that are living this thing out, they know how best to care for each other. And if we are willing to listen and we're willing to engage in that dialogue, they can teach us. So that encourages me. Your global neighbor knows what they need and what they want. And if we are willing to listen, they will teach us. And we can follow the example of Jesus in this also. Jesus, who looks at a man who cannot walk, and he says to him, do you want to be healed? Jesus, who looks at a man who is blind and says, what do you want me to do for you? This is Jesus, who is God, who knows all things and knows what is best for all people. And he does not presume to do for. He's asking the question. He's engaging in that learning. So we should too. And third, love compels us to desire and act for the flourishing of our global neighbor. This event has been themed, Love Your Neighbor, and it comes from that passage in the Gospels that says, love your neighbor as yourself. I think that until you say the full phrase, you might think it's enough to love your neighbor. But there's a scale, there's a measure, as yourself. Oh, now it's different. And at World Relief, we really take the words of Jesus in John 10:10 really seriously when he says that he has come to bring life in its fullness, wholeness of life, abundant life. As I mentioned in our vision, restored life, where a person is at peace with God, they're at peace with themselves, they're at peace with their neighbors, and they're at peace with all of creation. They are living in thriving families and in communities that are meshed together in relationship. And so we partner with the church so that the proclaimed gospel of God can go forth, but also that the tangible good news of fields planted and homes built and health secured and peace established, so that all of those things can be a reality in the places where we work. I'll tell you one last story as I close. I was in Rwanda recently, and I met a young man in his 20s. His name is Moses, and he was born blind. And he had previously relied on basically donations from his church. That was his way of kind of making it through life. And when the churches in his community partnered with World Relief and they started to come together and they established this church committee that I was talking about, they approached him and said, Moses, you are someone that we've approached that we see that there are many layers of vulnerability that you're facing. Tell us a little bit about your life and the vision that you have for yourself. And they told me that it was like Moses had been waiting for someone to ask him this question his entire life. He said, I want to be married. I want to have some kids. I want to build a house. I want to run a business. And I want an audio Bible so that I can follow what's happening in church. for myself. And the church committee was astonished. They were kind of like, we just wanted you not to have to deal with like handouts from the church anymore. They didn't have a full vision for Moses, but they said, okay, all right. So we've been trained in how to do savings groups. Moses, would you want to join a savings group? And you might think that's a little strange, but Moses was like, yes. And he was diligent in that group. Even if it was 5 cents a week, he was saving every week. And soon his savings started to accumulate. His diligence caught the eye of a woman in the savings group, like no kidding. And they and they started this business. They bought some chickens, and they started selling eggs. And then they diversified, and they were selling eggs in the morning when the kids were going to school, and they were selling peanuts in the evening when the kids were coming off of school as a snack. Now, don't get me wrong. Moses' life is still difficult. He still has a disability. His family still lives probably under less than $10 a day. But you see that Moses and his wife have found a measure of flourishing in the midst of their fragility. They are building a life, and they are making ways for themselves because they had a vision, and they had somebody that came alongside and said, this is how I can support. These are the things that I know: savings, business diversification, that we can teach you, that can help you get on the path for yourself. So Moses is on his way to pursuing that wholeness of life that he desires for himself and that Jesus desires for him. So what does this mean for all of you? How will you choose to live out these things that I've talked about in your own lives? I have 4 tangible things that you can do. Disclaimer, these are going to be very World Relief heavy because I work for World Relief, happen to think we're a fantastic organization to support. So the first thing that I will say is follow our social media. Actually check out our website and our blog. We often highlight the stories of individuals that we serve and families in the countries where we work. We cover a lot of the crises that may have fallen out of the news cycle, but that represent a lot of the suffering that's still happening around the world. So I really encourage you to check out those stories. You will see suffering that's happening around the world, but you will also see pictures of that flourishing that is starting to happen in different corners, and I think you will be encouraged by it. I want to encourage you to be a discerning consumer of information about your global neighbor. I love what Caitlin was saying earlier. There's a lot of information out there. But ask yourself, is the source that you're consuming, are they taking a posture of humility? Are they speaking from a place that has been informed with and by the communities that they're talking about? Are you listening to voices of people from the global communities that you're interested in? I want to encourage you, if you're able, think about becoming a monthly giver to World Relief's Path. It's our monthly giving program. You get to choose the amount that you want to give each month, but that contribution helps to put an individual or a family on that path to flourishing, to restoration. And if you don't do anything else, whenever I ask my team, I'm going to speak with some folks, what should I ask them? They say, pray. Pray for our teams. Pray for your global neighbor. Pray that God would strengthen them and help them in the daily hardships that they face. Pray that the local church would take their rightful place and partner to bring a fullness of life to people experiencing the greatest vulnerability. Thank you.